Hey guys, it's me, EODGamer here, and this is my version 1.2 meta tier list, of course, for the Memory of Chaos. Now, I'm going to be introducing two things. First things, of course, I'm going to be splitting this into two parts. First, we'll talk about the 5-star characters, and towards the back half, we're going to be talking about the 4-star characters. And I heard feedback from you guys, you wanted to see in this kind of format, so it's much more easier to understand as well. So if you appreciate such changes, do give me a like also. And now, without further ado, let's jump in first with the 5-star tier list. And the reason why I'm splitting them up is because I don't think it's fair to compare 5 stars and 4 stars in the same bracket, especially when one you might need to spend money on or your resources. The other one you can either get at a very low cost or more or less for free. Most of the characters here I'll be talking at E0. If you're interested at higher Eidolons, do leave me a comment as well. I can consider making those for 5-star characters at higher Eidolons as well. So first things first, Bronya, the first character on the list. Where do I think she stands? I do think that she got even better in version 1.2 compared to the previous patches. Of course, with a new 5-star character like Wind 5-star character like Blade, which she benefits a lot from because she's also Wind typing, which means she has access to Planetary Rendezvous, buffing him up. So wherever she was, and she was I think already S tier before that, she now got even stronger in version 1.2. Probably the best in class Harmony character by far right now, especially if you're a Blade main, you're playing Wind as your typing as well. I think super strong. Allows you to change your playstyle of certain characters like Blade, for example like Zealer, Jingyuan, to run with much less speed than otherwise they had to because of her basically a turn-based manipulation. So that's for Bronya. And since we are on the topic of Blade, let's talk about where he stands. He's also a new character in 1.2, so we didn't talk about him in our previous tier list so far. Blade is a tricky one to rate because if you have characters that supplement him or support him, like maybe Luota, you have excess of healers like Bailu and your Natasha, or maybe you have like enough sustain on both halves, Blade is going to feel very comfortable to use if you have like more choices in your roster for sustaining him. If you don't have much choices, like let's say you only have Natasha and maybe you have like Japad, Mark 7 the other half, you will find that he doesn't really work well with these like shielder type units in the roster, and this makes it a bit more tricky to play because you are forced to immediately play your second half defensive type units, because if he doesn't take damage, he doesn't like have his counter ability and his like so-called lifesteal element to his kit, which means that putting shielders with him is a direct DPS loss. You can still run it with thin shields like maybe Fire MC and stuff like that, but otherwise not as recommended as some other stuff. So I guess it really depends whether you have Luota or excess of healers. If you do, I definitely do think that he's an A+ character because he does good amounts of damage, very independent, doesn't really take up too much skill points, very similar to like Ireland in playstyle, just uses 1 skill point for 3 turns so that his enhanced basic attack can counter. If you have Luota, maybe he's probably an A+. If you have Bailu, probably an A+, because you have excess of sustain. If you are lacking of sustain, he's going to make your weaknesses even more worse for your account, because if you don't have good sustain already, you will feel like he's really desperate for healing and sustain so that you can protect him in case he falls to lower life. My Blade has about 8k HP, so even at like 50% life, he still has more HP than some Harmony characters altogether. So it's not really super squishy, but his manipulation of HP, like full HP or less, is quite tricky to play without a healer in your roster. With healer, A+, without healer, probably A or A-. Oh, I realized that there's a doubling of the bracket here. Let me just change that real quick. Let's put this as A-, and this one, I don't know, F tier, B, then straight to F. So I think that he's A+ if you have a healer, A- if you don't have a healer. A bit more tricky to use, but I'll put him A+ just for the sake of this video as well. The other thing, the other new character that hasn't been talked about would definitely be a character like Kafka. I've did many comparison videos of her as well as other lightning characters, and I think the conclusion that I have is she works very well at low investment, and even at higher investment, she can transition over to a secondary DPS, and DOT is very impressive. As of time of recording, the Memory of Chaos hasn't changed to the massive DOT buff as of version 1.2, so I think it's a pretty fair judgment of DOT characters rather than talking about them when they are at their best. This is like pretty fair valuation of DOT characters. And in my opinion, Kafka probably will be around the same tier as Blade A+ tier if you don't have alternatives, like maybe you don't have Jingyuan built already. In that case, I think that her value is slightly higher. If you have Jingyuan and you maybe have thinking of pulling Kafka, her value in your account probably would diminish a little bit more. But that doesn't affect like their rating on their own. We'll talk about Jingyuan in a little bit as well. But I do think Kafka probably somewhere around A+, a good amounts of damage, can't carry your account single-handedly, because I want to leave this like S tier to characters that really can like carries accounts as like your S tier characters in the game. So A+ is like decent, strong, quite good, but won't carry account single-handedly. So next up, Luota. A lot of you have heard my thoughts about him in my previous videos already. I mentioned that he was the best character in the game in version 1.1 in my opinion, like the best for value, best bang for buck. He does so much. He cleanses, he removes enemy buff, he heals without needing too much skill points because of his passive ability to proc every 50% or less. One ally gets healed full, only limited by a turn limit kind of thing. In my opinion, he's still S tier. Even with current characters in the game, I think he benefits even more because Blade is introduced to the game, synergizes very well with Luota. Right now, as a version 1.2 cast that we have, I do think that he's still the best character in the game. Probably likely might be contended for maybe best character in 1.3. We'll see how that goes. We already talked about it a little bit in the previous videos already. So if you're interested in upcoming changes, you might want to check that out as well. Next up, Zealer. I think this one is pretty easy. She definitely carries accounts, pretty straightforward. For now, we don't have an alternative to Zealer for single target damage. Even Blade's single target damage might not feel as good and comfortable to play as Zealer. She's really quite flexible. You put her with a buffer, harmony buffer, she still does a lot. Hasn't been contested yet as of late, so I think it's pretty good. The only other character that probably comes real close to her probably might be a single target damage dealer by Yanting, but Yanting also has a bit more criteria to fulfill than Zealer, of course. But we'll talk about that in a little bit. So the two remaining limited characters currently as a 1.2, we have Silverwolf. She's a very strong character, allowing you to compress the amount of elements you need because she puts weaknesses into enemy. She defends shreds, which makes it very good for DOT also. For those of you who don't know, DOT is able to increase in damage when the enemy's defenses are lower. So that is for Silverwolf in general. I do think that as you have more characters in the game, you will need Silverwolf less and less, because if you are looking for defense shred, you probably will go for a character like Pella. If you want specifically for elemental dropping in the enemy and elemental rest down, you likely only be running mono teams. We are in a current game state that we don't have enough characters in the game to build like full mono teams for everything, and yet we are still at a stage that is early game enough for us to still require Silverwolf because we don't have resources to pull many characters. So it's in a finicky situation that if you are a whale, you probably won't find so much value in Silverwolf because you have good enough teams that don't require maybe a defense shredder like Silverwolf and her kit in general. If you are a small spender of free to play, you'll find her tons of value because you don't have like every single element DPS in the game. And that is like, I think, the disparity between this character. In my opinion, if you have her at maybe you are free to play small spender, she probably will feel like an S or as well as an A+. Whereas if you are a whale and big spender, probably she'll feel somewhere around an A. I have never used her since version 1.1 ever since I pulled her, just because I have DPSs of every element already at very well built. I don't really need the weakness dropping that she does. I don't have enough characters to build a full mono teams yet because we don't have like sustain characters for every element. We don't have harmony characters for every element. So that's like my main thought. But for the sake of this video, I think I'll put her somewhere around A+. Definitely much more versatile compared to Blade as well as Kafka. But for the reasons that I mentioned, I think comparing like whales versus free to play, definitely if you have more characters in the game, she does feel a bit more lackluster, and less characters better. This is always a funny one to do. Jingyuan, what do I think about him? I have never ever said this character was good since closed beta in 2022. And good is always subjective. Why do I say he's not good? It's because the options that are available and the flexibilities that they provide give much more versatility compared to Jingyuan. If you look at the current top 6 over here, the limited characters versus Jingyuan, he's a hyper carry nature, which means that he needs a certain set of conditions to thrive, whereas the other characters here can pretty much be fit into most teams, maybe with the exception of Blade, you just slap on Blade in like some healer team, he probably will work. But you can't just randomly slap on Jingyuan into any roster. The only character that probably comes close in terms of hyper carry out of all the limited characters that we have is Zealer, but Zealer is much more flexible because she doesn't really like superly need a dedicated buffer like Bronya for her. It makes her work much better, but she doesn't like not function without her as well. In this case, I think it's very, very difficult to rate him. I think that he's very good at high investments. If you have Before Dawn, his signature light cone, very, very high crit damage, I could see his numbers popping off very nicely. But if you are maybe not, you have many characters built, you don't have the resources to min-max every single character, he probably will feel like an A- in your account, at least for mine as well, if you don't like dedicate all your life savings and all your resources, your time farming his gear. But if you do, of course, I do think he can come close to maybe an A+ tier. Maybe slightly lower than Kafka in terms of versatility, but for the sake of this video, I think that it's more fair to justify him on a general majority of people. If I were to recommend A+ as slightly higher recommendation, I'll probably put him as A, simply because I don't think that he meets the bar of the other limited characters that we have in game. Probably this will be my ranking. And this is going to be the ranking for my current thoughts on limited characters in version 1.2. He did get nice changes from follow-up, but I don't think it's significant enough to make him a lot stronger in the S tier carrying accounts and stuff like that. He still does need to be carried first before he starts carrying accounts, and that is the main downside of like hyper carry nature in general, especially at super high investment. Let's talk about like standard 5 stars now before we jump into 4 stars. Easy ones to talk about. Let's talk about Himiko first. I think there are much more fire weakness enemies in the game right now compared to previously. I noticed like even the monkey that has been introduced, all the mobs, the doggos, all seem to have a bit more fire weakness. The enemy lineup also seems to have a bit more AoE focus, which does benefit Jingyuan and Himiko in that sense. Maybe it's because both Blade as well as Kafka has AoE in their kit, so they wanted to introduce more AoE damage element in version 1.2. Who really knows, right? Previously, I think she was like ranked as a B tier by a lot of people. I do think that she feels a lot better to play now. I probably might rank her A-, and I could see myself bringing her up to A in future, especially when a new Fire Hun DPS Topaz is going to be released. Of course, it has just been drip marketed yesterday. That's like slated to be like 1.4 and stuff like that. If you want to hear my thoughts specifically on the new character Topaz, check out the video that I have. I just did it yesterday. Super new still. Check it out. I think it'll be interesting for you to hear my thoughts if you are a Himiko main. I don't think she's going to be not meta for long. She might ever come into a bit more use in future once that situation arises. We also did talk about will Himiko ever be meta, so I look forward to that day where it actually comes. Next up we have Clara. I think Clara is still a very strong unit, probably single-handedly able to carry accounts, but to put her up in S tier along the likes of these other characters, I think is a bit of a stretch. She does feel somewhere in an A+ to me right now. Very strong counters, doesn't really care. The more enemy mobs, she also does benefit. Quite independent with very good versatility. She was my top pick of a standard character going to official launch, and I think a lot of you might also feel that she's also really strong. In that case, I probably will put her maybe slightly ahead of Silverwolf or behind. I'm not too sure where exactly I want to put her. For the sake of the video, I think I'll put it more of like just behind Silverwolf, but really it can go either way. So any of you who are watching like commentary at this point, I think it's either way. If any of you like Clara mains disagree, do you think she should be higher or lower? Let me know. I don't have her on my account, so my information is based on what I see as well as like beta information. Of course, I do watch a lot of games as well by the community, seeing how y'all clear the memory of chaos, and she still seems pretty strong on most accounts. On my sub account, she's also doing pretty fairly well. So I think that she's still deserving of an A+ role. She's the only character I don't have in the game right now in version 1.2. Hoyoverse just doesn't want to give me her for some reason to test. And okay, next up, Bailu. Bailu is still a very strong character, even though, of course, Lota is now in the game. She might not be as relevant, especially if maybe you have a very well-built Natasha, you're playing like Natasha in the other half, and you already have Lota. So if you have Lota, I think that Bailu will drop slightly because the necessity for your account is not as high. But for most people right now as of version 1.2, you probably only have one healer right now. It's like free play Natasha. And if you don't have Japat, chances are you won't have like both of these as well, because standard 5 stars are a little bit difficult to get, especially since there's an RNG element on getting which one. If you take out Japat, like you don't have Japat, I think that Bailu will rank slightly around here. maybe right now in the game as of version 1.2 and A+, she will not carry accounts like before in the earlier game where sustain is super necessary. Now I find you can pretty much get by with maybe like a Natasha as well as some chunkier characters like maybe Blade together with like Kafka and stuff like that. As long as you're not running like pure squishy team, I think it should be more or less fine. I do think that she deserves slightly less than the highest tier, A+ tier, just for the sake of the difference. Still, I think healers are still very good. And let's talk about Jett now, since we just talked about a more defensive character. Jett, on the other hand, has freeze in his kit. He also has team-wide shielding. In my opinion, like right now as a version 1.2, I do think that he's a little bit better than Bailu. He's cheaper to build, he does have crowd control in his kit, his stick shield is very massive, and with the new effect resistance set and speed set, I do think he benefits from it as well. He can give crit damage to the whole team, he can give speed up to the whole team, moves pretty fast, so he has good amounts of CC. Doesn't offer too much damage, so I'll be interested to see what Fucc brings, and probably might dethrone him as the best preservation unit in the game right now, but as of version 1.2, I think Jett is still probably top pick for most people trying to push through Memory of Chaos 10. I don't use him anymore on my account. I think DPS works better once you're in a very late stage, but for most players, I'm taking into account like most of you might be still pushing Memory of Chaos 10. If you can't auto battle it like the game that you're seeing in the background, probably he still feels pretty valuable for most accounts as well. Next up, Well. Well is very strong. I think he's good amounts of slow nihility character, meaning he can be worked in many ways. Previously in 1.1 and 1.0, a lot of people were playing him as a main DPS because the Memory of Chaos allowed for it. Now I don't think the nihility buffs are as strong for this character, which means that he probably won't be able to cheese a main DPS role as well, probably relegated to maybe a secondary DPS, AoE DPS kind of nature, but still tons of value. I think Well will rank somewhere around A+. If I were to put it honestly, somewhere maybe slightly before Blade, he does offer a lot of value, a lot of damage as well, in my opinion at least. So I'll put him up here in A+. Yanqing's super strong. I think he's a very good DPS. If you don't have Zealer and you have Yanqing, probably you won't feel a lot of difficulty in the game. He does a lot of single target damage. Does need a little bit of babysitting here and there with like Jett, March 7. I have most characters in the game. Personally, I still use Yanqing in my second team without shield also. I think he works very fine. I'll rank him as an A+, slightly higher than Silverwolf. He does almost carry accounts. The only downside is he does have a bit of requirement to be either protected or have a bit more investment. I think he's still very solid ice character. And this will probably be my 5-star tier list. As we can see, it's very top loaded here in higher categories. Also because of their stats, pools is much higher than other characters. And I just think that it's deserving because a lot of them you have to pay money for. So there's no doubt that your limited characters are slightly higher. And 5-star characters are never cheap to come from. It would suck if they're all like F tier, B tier, A- tier. The game wouldn't exist then, as it can't fund any spending. So that's my thoughts. Let me just refresh this, and I'm going to put the 4 stars in, and we can see. Note that 5 stars and 4 stars can't be compared like directly side by side as well. Okay, now let's on to the 4-star segments. Let me start off with Natasha. In my opinion, I have most characters in the game. Out of all of them, the one that I have used the most since day 0, like when we started playing and everything, it has been Natasha. She has always been in my party. I've never taken her out of most of my team comps, even though I have Bailu, I have Jett as well as Lota. She still feels it. I think that she still carries account. In my opinion, probably the best free-to-play character as of version 1.2. Super strong. Next up, we have Asta. Asta is a harmony character, works very well. Fire has also been a bit more relevant in the game, especially when characters like Blade were introduced. He doesn't really scale too much with, for example, attack percentage that Asta offers, but still more speed might be good. Doesn't work super well with him, but works very well with Kafka, who is more of a DOT element in her roster. I think Asta got a slight buff because of Kafka in terms of usability versus the other characters who scale off a lot with crit rate, crit damage. In my opinion, I think previously maybe some people might rate her A. I think she will rate a low A+. Just because she's also a harmony character which can use many versatile amounts of for example light cones and stuff like that. Herta, I think she's still very difficult to play right now, even though there's more like follow-up buffs, a bit more trickier to build in general. You would never want to run Herta, especially if you can run other ice characters with very good amounts of AoE. If you do require like ice damage, I think March 7 will be a much better alternative to consider. She also has AoE ice in her kit, and ice as a source of damage now is like not super important until enemies only have ice weaknesses. I think that's when Herta will start to shine. But for now, I probably use her, leave her at a unusable tier. I think it's quite difficult to maximize her potential. It is possible still, no doubt, but the investment value you put in some of these other characters will be way more justified compared to investing everything into Herta as well. Those are just some of my honest thoughts. March 7 right now, out of all of the characters in the game 4 stars, March 7 is a character that I use very often. She's very, very versatile. She has freeze, she has shielding, and E6 she also heals, so it's very good for my teams as well. I do play her in my Memory of Chaos team because I have 8 to choose from and I play like the best teams. So in my opinion, March 7 ranks somewhere around like A+. A bit tricky to build, as I've mentioned in like my recent video as well. I talk about a tricky character to master. I think March 7 is one of them. If you can understand and learn how this character works and utilize her full kit to her potential, I think she will not disappoint. But a lot of people just take it that this character is just a shielder with draws aggro, which is very, very surface value. And if you're interested to find out more about March 7 and why I even use her having many characters in the game, check out the other video on the channel as well. I'll link in the video card above for those of you who are interested too. But anyway, next up, Serval. Serval has somehow been relatively forgotten, especially with all the debate about Jingyuan and Kafka, but she's still a very strong lightning character. At E0, it's also strong. Of course, E6 does get a little bit stronger, but her Eidolons don't really like break the character in totality. I think she's a pretty decent unit. And I'm torn between like A tier, A+ tier. For a 4-star DPS, I think she's not too bad. I'll probably put her around an A tier, not as usable as other characters that are supportive in nature, because taking into consideration that likely you will have some 5-star DPS characters in your list. If you don't have like 5-star DPSs, she probably will be an A+. If you have 5-star DPSs, likely will be an A as a secondary option for your team as well. Pella, I think quite clear. Pella is probably S tier for the sake of there are many units in the Memory of Chaos that she can remove the buffs, like the healing unit and the revive units, remove the buffs, tremendous power. She also acts as something like a pseudo harmony character where you can defense threat, and when you have more characters that scale off of non-attack or crit rate, crit damage kind of buffs, defense matters a bit more, especially like if you are a DOT unit. You strip the defense of the enemy, you don't care whether you scale with HP or attack, you don't care whether you crit or not. Defense shredding is universal as well. I think Pella is still S tier, probably got even stronger in version 1.2 because of the synergies as well. Now I removed someone. Who did I remove? I think I removed Herta. Let me just put her back real quick. And next up, Sampo. So we are doing this video before the 1.2 DOT massive buff in the 3rd phase, so I think it's going to be quite fair still because we haven't seen how OP DOT is when the buff is like totally favoring them. In my opinion, well, good amounts of wind damage, especially now with Kafka in the game. He does see a lot more play, a lot more people are starting to build him. I can also see in my statistics as well for my video usage or views as well. I think that Sampo probably will be around A tier. If you have Kafka, might even feel like A+ tier for the amount of value it creates. I will likely leave him at A tier. Good AoE damage, good wind break damage as well. Still very strong in my opinion. I did a comparison of like, do you really need Blade? And I showcased how fast Sampo shreds wind damage. And it's actually pretty good. So if you don't have Blade, this is definitely a solid choice to think about. Next character is main MC. This is physical. I think I'll talk about the female MC as Fire. Let's talk about them together so it's not too confusing. It's not like gender bias or anything. This is Fire, this is physical. I think physical MC is not that strong. There are many better options. Any of you chats who are like playing him as your main DPS still, likely he is very brave. A lot more resources needs to be funneled in this character too, because he doesn't have very good scaling. His kit is all over the place in my opinion. They don't really like double down on his strengths, but it's nice to have both single target and AoE damage, and you can choose. Still does decent amount of damage. A very plain vanilla character. It's like your typical starting point. Fire MC on the other hand is very versatile. Good amounts of taunt. You are able to shield your entire team with defensive gear. Hardly takes damage. I think you can stack up to like 70% damage reduction on this character. Super strong. I'm thinking of like putting S or A+ tier. I likely will put it as S tier if you don't have any other like healing characters, any other 5 stars. You're stuck with your plain vanillas. You skip Luota. You don't have Japat. You don't have Pailu. Probably will feel like an S tier. If you have at least one healer or one defensive unit 5-star in your team, probably will feel like an A+ or maybe an A depending on how much you have. I personally don't use her anymore in my account because I have enough sustain options. I prefer go more for damage. But depending on where you are, I probably will leave her at S tier for now. To factor in, most players do not have many 5-star characters in their account. Hook, very slow, very big damage. Right now, Fire, not as important. Single target mostly, also not really very favored now. It seems to be shifting more towards like AoE meta for version 1.2 and damage over time. I think Huynh deserves right here A-. She does very good amounts of damage, but not in the meta right now. I do see her changing maybe in the upcoming when fire becomes more relevant in the future too, which is in line with Himiko. Whenever Himiko moves, she will likely move too. Next up, Tingyun, definitely still strong. I think Tingyun, maybe, if you're talking about like 4-star alone, I think she still ranks better than S-star. But if you're talking like comparing with Bronya, putting her S tier with Bronya is not accurate. So if you are like looking at this tier list as specifically for 4 stars, I think she'll rest as S tier. She does a lot. She does a lot attack buff. She buffs energy as well. Tons of value. Lightning is also a very popular element. You have like 3 to 4 main DPSs that could be like Ireland, Serval, you have Jingyuan, you have Kafka, all can benefit from her. So she's super relevant still. In my opinion, hyper carry is like still a thing. Definitely S tier right now. If you are comparing like 4-star, 5-star, which I do not advise to, she'll like definitely still be lower than Bronya in my opinion. Next up, Qingque. She differs very greatly from E6 to E0. If you are like me, you never get her successes and you drink all your skill points because you have just bad gacha luck, she will probably feel a bit more difficult to use, maybe in B tier. But if your gacha luck is like insanely good, you just press one button and she always gets her full stacks. Or maybe, for example, you have her at E6. I do think it varies quite a lot. In my opinion, probably if you have E6, would feel like an A+ or S tier. If you do not have E6, for example, I do think she starts to feel somewhere around like Huynh level, maybe not as usable as her. But I think for the sake of this video, I'm going to leave her here because not everyone has E6. If not, this will be like a E6 tier list of every single character. But let me know if you guys are interested in like doing a much more higher Eidolons. I just didn't feel like a lot of people will have max Eidolons right now at this stage. And next up, we have Susang. So Susang still a very solid physical DPS. We don't have a 5-star physical DPS in the game, so I think she is very strong still. In my opinion, probably much more versatile than Serval and Sampo, especially if you don't pull Zealer. If you don't have Zealer, definitely you will likely turn to Susang as your single target damage dealer. For that reason and her versatility, I probably will put her at A+. Okay, Yukong. I think Yukong will vary also very greatly depending whether you have her at high Eidolons or at E0. At E0, she'll feel very clunky to play, so probably around B to A-. Not very usable because you need to like speed tune your characters, you have to be very mindful of your 2-turn cooldown. But if you do have her at higher Eidolons, I do think that she's probably even better than Tingyun. She does a lot more damage, very easy to control because when you ult, you get one stack immediately, so you automatically get the buffs. But because this video is at lower investment, I'll probably place her somewhere around A- tier. She's still usable if you don't have Tingyun, you don't have Bronya, and you want like an imaginary harmony character. But for other than that, right now, I don't see her being super useful until maybe Imbibitor Lunae comes out, which is like an imaginary destruction character. Might feel a lot more useful then. So for now, I probably will leave her at A- as of version 1.2. I likely see this increasing in version 1.3 and beyond as well. Next up, original Danheng, the 4-star Danheng. What do I think about him in terms of his rank right now? Definitely, he was a very strong DPS, especially if you have him at the start, you build him for win DPS, still does a lot of damage. A lot of my free-to-play runs on my account, you can see, actually clears a lot of content with just Danheng. But in my opinion right now, because of the favoring of the meta towards slightly more AoE in nature, and he doesn't really move that fast, he executes the target, doesn't go again, and Susang has like self-push, so you get a bit more movement speed out of her, a bit more AoE element where she can hit more units as well, and physical is of course a rare element. With Danheng, your competition really is win characters like Sampo as well as Blade, but you're also competing with other Han DPSs, and at this stage, most people might have Han characters well built already because of tackling content, and I think he will rank somewhere around A tier, not as high as Susang, who offers a bit more rarer element versatility in his overall kit. And last two, and we have Ireland.